Hello and welcome to Factually. I'm Adam Conover. Thank you so much for joining me on the show again. As I speak to you, we're in the middle of a violent and racist anti-immigration campaign led by the White House and the president who resides within it. This hatred of immigrants is an excuse for the administration to employ nakedly authoritarian tactics. Just the other weekend, Trump called in thousands of National Guard members to my city of Los Angeles to violently suppress protests against these immigration raids, which were hurting and injuring innocent people. It is a really frightening time in America. But immigration becoming a flashpoint isn't really a surprise because for years, Trump has talked about immigrants, and particularly those from Latin America, in horrendous terms. He called Mexicans rapists, Venezuelans all gang members, accused Haitians of eating dogs. He's done everything possible to declare that these people, who are our literal neighbors, both geographically and in our own communities, as impossibly foreign, separate, dangerous to us. It's bizarre. He has a vision of the United States that is somehow magically divorced from the rest of the hemisphere, as though we're a special place that needs to be protected from everyone else who lives here. But I hate to break it to Trump, America has been part of the Americas, well, forever. It's not just that nearly 1 in 5 Americans is of Hispanic or Latino descent, although that's important. The United States' history is permanently intertwined with that of every other country in this hemisphere and vice versa. The history that we learn about in school tends to focus on how America has interacted with England and Europe, even China, but the U.S. became the country it is today through its constant and continued interaction with the rest of the Americas to our south. And if we want to understand this profoundly dangerous and troubling moment, we need to look back and examine that history to see how we are interlinked and to look at how our countries have influenced and affected each other reciprocally. Now, we have an incredible historian on the show today to talk to us about this, to dive into the history in deep detail. And I want to remind you that if you want to support this show and conversations just like this that we bring you, that educate you, enlighten you, and surprise you, please support us on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/Adam Conover. $5 a month gets you every episode of the show ad-free. We also have a community book club. We got a lot of other wonderful community features. We would love to have you. And of course, if you want to come see me on the road, head to adamconover.net for all my tickets and tour dates. And now let's get to this week's episode. I'm so thrilled to have this guest on the show. He is a Pulitzer Prize winning professor of history at Yale, and his most recent book is América, América, A New History of the New World. I know you are going to find this interview fascinating. Please welcome Greg Grandin. Greg, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
We're at a really weird moment with the United States' relation to the rest of the world, but especially to Latin America, to the countries to our south, where President Trump is declaring anybody from this region of the world, persona non grata, a disgusting alien who needs to be removed, and also creating these strange relationships with countries like El Salvador, where we're imprisoning people on their soil. You have just written a wonderful book about America's relationship with South America. How do you view this moment in history?
Well, I think it's a continuation of a long history. The book that I just wrote, América, América, is a 500-year history that looks at first the British Empire and then the Spanish Empire relations, and then independent Latin America and the United States. And Trump in many ways is a kind of resurrection, an open resurrection of a kind of conqueror vision of the new world, of a kind of a very, very arrogant, rough handling of Latin America, in which Latin America stands in as a kind of resource for the United States. I mean, think of how they just turned El Salvador into a kind of devil's island, right?
Yeah.
I mean, a place in which the excess of the United States gets cast off onto. And in many ways, Trump is kind of resurrecting that relationship. On the other hand, he's also building ties with what might be considered a kind of Pan-American MAGA movement. He's got close allies in countries like Peru and Ecuador and El Salvador and Argentina. And on the other hand, Latin America is also pushing back. Latin America in some ways has returned to its historical role as a kind of check on the United States. Now, if you just think back just a couple of decades, to George W. Bush's administration, not that long ago, but long ago.
Honestly, I feel like we really memory hold George W. Bush's administration.
I know.
Lived through it. It was a big time of my life, and I'm like, oh yeah, that guy.
That guy. Oh, the global war on terror. Oh,
Yeah.
right. Oh, rendition.
Yeah.
Global rendition, which is not really that different. The difference is that the difference with Trump and the people that came before is that Trump is willing to kind of openly talk about it and celebrate it, whereas the Bush administration, I mean, they talked about it and they tried to legalize it, but they were torturing people. They created a global torture and disappearance network.
But they tried to hide it.
Now, Latin America during that period, when Chavez was president of Venezuela, when Lula was president of Brazil, the Kirchners were in charge of Argentina. Evo Morales there was a very outsized left in Latin America that stood up to the Bush administration's attempt to kind of conscript them into the global war on terror. And they were quite effective. Every continent in the world participated in Bush's global rendition program. Even Sweden allowed the CIA flights to take off from there, in which they went off and carried captives to third world countries where they'd be tortured, except Latin America. Latin America absolutely refused to participate because they had experience with that in the Cold War. So now jump forward, and and Latin America really, under Bush, put out a very forceful opposition to the very principles of the war on terror. Jump forward 20 years to Trump, and there's still a left in power in some countries, but it's much weaker. And it doesn't, and they're still trying to oppose here and there when they can. There's Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico. There's Gustavo Petro in Colombia. There's Lula in Brazil, but they're not quite as dominant as they were 20 years ago. And the reason why they the reason why they're not as strong, rhetorically strong, is because over the last 20 years, a kind of Trumpism has infected Latin American politics, the kind of culture wars that Trump represents. And so Trump is coming to power. Now Trump himself winds up often sabotaging the potential of building a Pan-American Trumpism, right? So in his orders in his recent declaration of who can enter the country, he banned Venezuelans and Cubans,
right?
Which, this is such a reversal from a traditional kind of Cold War strategy of courting anti-communists in Latin America, particularly Cubans,
right?
And so Trump being Trump, he seems to undercut his own ability of being of stabilizing what could be a Pan-American Trumpism or MAGA internationalism. But we do see its most brutal expression in where we started with El Salvador, the idea that we're going to use that country as a kind of devil's island.
Yeah. Why has Trumpism taken over Latin America? I mean, is it a result of Trump, or is it other forces that are sort of, is it the same forces that gave us Trump are bringing that same culture war there?
Well, I would say that the traditional right couldn't respond effectively to the post-Cold War revival of the Latin American left. This is one of the things that I talk about in the book, is the persistence of the social democratic ideal in Latin America. That despite the violence of the Cold War, despite the horrors and terrors and disappearances and massacres and wars and all the coups that Washington sponsored, as soon as voters were allowed to vote their preference again, right? As soon as the dictatorships gave way to democracy when the Berlin Wall fell, they started voting in leftists. And these were leftists that were very creative. They were very imaginative. They represented all different traditions of the Latin American left. They were liberation theologians. They were feminists. They were trade unionists. They were populists. They were Peronists. And that was the leftists that came around the time of the Bush administration. And traditional conservatives couldn't win elections against them. Traditional conservatives meaning law and order conservatives, patrician conservatives, patria familia conservatives, conservatives that were, businessmen conservatives. So in a lot of ways, in reaction to a dominant left, they started making ties with groups in the United States like the Atlas Foundation, Libertarians, or the NRA. You know, I mean, one marker of this turn is in 2004, Brazil was about to have a referendum banning guns, and was overwhelmingly popular. It had 80%. They were going to have a poll, and we were going to nationwide gun control the NRA spent millions of dollars influencing that poll.
Really? The American NRA, obviously.
Yeah. They developed. The NRA has a foreign policy.
Wow.
And so the poll lost. The vote lost. Everybody thought it was going to win, and it lost. And now in the Bolsonaro clan, you know, the kind of Brazil's version of Trump, you know, very Trumpy in all its aspects, and its conspiracy theories, and its over the top culture war politics. Bolsonaro talks about the Second Amendment as if the Second Amendment is in the Brazilian Constitution. He does. He talks about the sacred right of the Second Amendment in the Brazilian Constitution has nothing to do with guns. It has to do with
God knows. You know what it is?
I can't remember what it is.
Maybe that's their one about soldiers not being quartered in your house.
About guns, but that's the way. That's the way. And religious groups, you know, a lot of those, kind of Reconstructionist and Pentecostal and very conservative religious groups, Christian Zionists, have made ties with Latin American Protestants to weaken the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church itself is, of course, split between conservatives and liberals, and Francis represented the more progressive wing of the Catholic Church. So there's lots of ways in which ties and networks were being built over the last 20 years to prevent, as a way of creating a new right, a new cultural right. So a lot of the culture, Latin America didn't have a culture war, right? The politics of left versus right was mostly about economics and class, and now it has a culture war. Now they hate Judith Butler. You know, they don't like Judith Butler. Just like now they talk about Judith Butler. They talk about grooming. They talk about They talk about anchor babies. You know, I mean, Latin America has birthright citizenship, just like the United States does.
Yeah.
Trump is completely wrong when he says that we're the only country in the world. It's a new world thing. Every country in Latin America has birthright citizenship, and for the most part, it's holding. But there is a rising movement against it, and now you hear the word anchor babies. You hear the word, but translated into Spanish and Portuguese.
Yeah,
and so you do see this kind of magnification of Latin American politics. That said, it's important to stress that the left in Latin America is still strong. Like the majority of people in Latin America, out of 460 million people, 400 million of them live under countries governed by people who identify as left or social democrats. And so the social democratic tradition is very strong. And one of the arguments of the book is the importance of Latin America in defeating fascism during World War II, which the book works up to, but then also just the vision of why that Latin Americans thought they were fighting not just against fascism, but they were fighting for social democracy, a vision of democracy that entailed social rights. And one of the main tensions of the book is a United States culture, political culture that fetishizes individual rights, negative rights, from a constitution that mandates a virtuous state as standing down, as allowing the greatest amount of liberty for individual room, to believe, to act, to assemble, to own guns, if that's your interpretation. Whereas in Latin America, they have a legal tradition that incorporates negative rights or political rights or individual rights, but deeply ingrained, and it goes back to the conquest, is what the argument is the idea of social rights or economic rights, that a virtuous state also stands up and captures surplus value and redistributes it in the form of social rights, in the form of education, in the form of healthcare, right, and in the form of living a dignified, old age, and the right to form unions. So every Latin American constitution, and this is so deeply ingrained, even during the even during the worst of the Cold War violence, constitutions in Latin America continued to define the state as obligated to provide education and provide healthcare and provide a dignified retirement. And that tension between social rights, which I argue are actually invented in Latin America, and individual rights, which the United States is the last industrialized country to cling to individual rights, right? There's no fetish of individual rights in France or in Germany. I mean, or Great Britain, they believe in social rights. What is it about the United States that's so that has led it to be so committed? And that commitment to individual rights is one of the things that bind the right together. You know, the different constituencies of the right in different ways. And the argument of the book is the importance of confronting extremism with the robust platform of social democracy.
You say that the belief in social democracy goes back to the conquest in Latin America. I'd love to go back to that time and just talk about what makes the social history of Latin America so different from the social history of the United States. I feel like it must be rooted in that time of European conquest and the ways it went differently in the United States, and I'm going to say Canada and Latin America. Right?
Yeah, they didn't call it social democracy at the time or social rights, obviously, but the book, Spain, the Spanish colonial project, the conquest, happens 100 years before the Puritans arrived in North Atlantic, and it's driven by an expanding Spanish state that understands itself as the agent of world Catholicism, and Catholicism understands itself as a universal religion, as a religion that bears all the world's history and all the world's wisdom, and then they all of a sudden they discover that there's millions of people living in a part of the world that they didn't even know about.
Right.
There was no denial that the Americas were populated. It was just a question of the nature of the people. And so the book goes into these debates among Catholic theologians and priests and jurists, and a small minority of them that basically create the terms, the moral revulsion and backlash towards the violence of the conquest and the extreme suffering of the conquest and the way the conquistadores set themselves on Native Americans, with an extreme ferocity and bloodlust, created a kind of moral revolution within Catholicism equal to the Reformation, which takes place outside of Catholicism. That's a break. Yeah. But within Catholicism, there's people like Francisco Vitoria, a Dominican, and Bartolome de las Casas, who's on the front lines, and he's watching the violence. And out of this debate comes some political terms and ideas that challenge the very legitimacy of the conquest. The idea that all humanity is one, that we all share a singular lineage, that the people of the Americas are not animals or subhuman, that they narrow the terms of war what is a just war to very small margin, and they argue against slavery in all of its forms. Now, this doesn't actually obviously ameliorate the conquest. The conquest goes on, but it does create this debate or this embryo of political social democratic modernity within the Catholic Church. And the Spanish Empire itself, even though it understands itself as universal, it recognizes the difference of Native Americans, and it organizes itself around difference. And Native Americans and African American slaves become the center of the Spanish American imperial project, right? They're extracting the wealth that creates the first universal currency. They're extracting the silver from Potosí in Bolivia, and that creates the world's first universal currency, and that begins to bind the world together. But Native Americans and African Americans are also the center of the moral vision of what the empire is. And so there's no in other words, there's no denial, a grappling with the nature. Whereas if we jump ahead to North America, right? Epidemics had already wiped out most of the North Atlantic indigenous population around Plymouth, around Cape Cod, around Massachusetts. So, so the Mayflower arrives and they're like, look, where is everybody?
Yeah.
Everybody's gone, they left us these houses.
Yeah. The myth of an empty continent.
The myth of an empty continent, the myth of evasion. And this is explicit. Like there's one document that I discuss in the book, the Virginia Company in 1608. They have a meeting, they call a meeting, and they say, should we issue some document to explain what we want to do in America, how to justify it? So they have a multi-day debate, and all they're doing is talking about Spain and the Spanish debates. And they're like, look, the Spanish Dominicans have been arguing this for a century, and they can't justify conquest. So maybe it's better we don't say anything. So evasion is built in. Evasion and denial is baked into the British, the Anglo settlement project right from the beginning. And then they arrive in an area that they imagine as being empty. And I don't want to downplay the role that Native Americans played, both as early slaves, but then also as in the fur trade. But Native Americans were pushed to the margins, right? They were like shadow players in the wings of Puritan imagination, intense solipsism of Puritan theology, in which they're arguing about predestination and is this a sign of God's displeasure? Am I saved? Am I not saved? Indians had nothing to do with that, except they were any more than a wolf attack did. But in Spanish America, Native Americans were central to the whole moral project.
Yeah.
So two things happen with this. And one, by the time you get to the independence movements, in the United States, the people who led the independence movements have no problem with the Anglo settlement and conquest. They think that they did nothing wrong, which was a discovered country. We didn't John Adams famously said, America was settled, not discovered. Everything was fine. Spanish American independence leaders understood their break from Spain as an atonement for the conquest.
Wow.
As they and this is where the sociality comes in, and this is where the social rights comes in, and this is where the idea that there's no such thing as an individual without society. The critique of those early Dominicans were that it was not Native Americans who were dehumanized. It was the Spanish conquerors who had dehumanized themselves by breaking free of all moral authority and landing on Native Americans as if they were tigers, as if they were wolves, as if they were animals, right? Stripped of society, human beings are nothing but animal. So this notion that there's no such thing as an individual without society, without kind of a larger transcendent value, was present very much both in the early critique of the conquest, but then also during the independence movements. So all of those, in Latin America, all of the early independence constitutions said, as we talked about earlier, yes, we have individual rights and right to print and a right to believe and a right to this and a right to that, but there is no individuality without society. And individualism is conditioned by what a good society is, and that is what I argue is the beginning of social rights.
Wow.
Right? Whereas, so if you look at the first Latin American, Spanish American Constitution in Venezuela in 1812, the word social appears 9 times, the word society appears 13 times. You look at the U.S. Constitution, neither of those words appear at all. Right? There's no sense at all that there's that the general good entails anything other than the accumulated sum of individual interests, whereas Spanish Americans believed in some kind of transcendent value that was higher than the individual, an individual right.
This episode is brought to you by Alma. If you're struggling with your mental health, it's easy to look to the internet for solutions. After all, isn't social media supposed to be social? But I think you know as well as I do that the more time we spend on the internet, the more isolated we can begin to feel. And at the end of the day, there is no replacement for real human relationships. That's why I want to tell you about Alma. Alma makes it simple to find a licensed therapist who gets you, someone who can offer support tailored to your specific needs and goals. In fact, 83% of people who see a therapist through Alma say their provider is the right fit, and Alma therapists bring real experience to the table, on average 6 years of it, with 20% practicing for over a decade. Their easy-to-use directory lets you filter by things like gender, specialty, ethnicity, and more, so you can find someone you truly connect with. You can even schedule free 15-minute consultations to make sure it feels right before committing to a session. Better with people, better with Alma. Visit helloalma.com/factually to get started and schedule a free consultation today. That's helloalma.com/factually. Hey folks, I'm on the road right now. I'm in New York City. And one thing I notice that happens to me when I'm on the road for a long time is I start to lose touch with the news a little bit because I'm not getting my normal info sources. I'm not talking to my friends I normally talk to about the news. And often I'm spending so much time out there exploring that I don't have time to, just be glued to my phone or my laptop reading every single story that comes out. And that means that I can miss a lot of the news, and I can also miss the context around the news, how the story is being told. And that's why when I'm on the road, I rely on ground news. Ground news is this amazing aggregator. One of the best things is, for any particular topic, it collects all the stories about that topic from every different news source, so you can catch up really quickly with what happened. And it gives every news source a bias and a factuality rating so that you can be sure that you know exactly what perspective they're writing from. Is it a far right source? Is it a center left source? That doesn't mean that what they're writing is wrong, but it lets you know, here's what these people are saying about this story, and here's what these people are saying instead. It also gives you a factuality rating so you know exactly how factual this source typically is, which is really helpful when you're trying to catch up quickly. So if that sounds good to you, if you want to be more up to date, if you want to break out of your bubble, check out Ground News. We use them in our research process. I use it when I'm on the road, and I know that you're going to love it too. And guess what? If you want to give it a try, you can get 40% off of a membership if you go to groundnews.com/factually. Once again, that's 40% off if you go to groundnews.com/factually.
I think what you're really showing here is why it's part of why the United States has honestly hated Latin America on some level for so long. Yeah. I mean, part of it, and tell me if you think this is correct, part of it has always seemed to me that it's about what happened to that indigenous population in the United States, and I think to a lesser extent Canada. It was a sort of a disappearing, a rendering invisible. Yeah. There's nobody here. We're just taking over. Oh, there's some people. Yeah, we'll just we'll push them to some reservations.
Native Americans weren't made citizens until 1924. In Latin America, independence constitutions immediately said there's nothing but citizens. Mexico in 1814, anybody born in Mexico is a Mexican. It was the first instance of what we call birthright citizenship. Mm-hmm. It was in the first Mexican Constitution in 1814. Wow. And now, don't get me wrong, racism continued, and a racial hierarchy organized around racial identity and, continued. It was easier to defeat the Spanish troops than it was to dismantle the social system they left in place. But the idea, at least, that everybody within a given nation was a member of that nation was very distinct than what happened in the United States. So much so that James Madison in 1926 says, we have and he uses the phrase, red man at the border and black man in our bosom. He said, no problem presents itself to the United States more than this, like what to do with these two groups of people. Maybe we should look at Latin America, particularly Peru and Mexico, because they seem to have constituted nations that included Native Americans and free people of color. And maybe we should look at them. But of course, there was another current within the United States, John Calhoun, who said we have nothing to learn from Spanish America. Their fatal error was to raise up the black man to people of color as equals to the whites, and that's why they can't establish political.
And I think when you look at in the political culture of the United States, why are all the nations to our south dangerous, dirty, filthy, full of brown people we don't like. It's because they made their indigenous populations like true citizens and, created a blended society, whereas the United States maintained the fiction of a white society.
Yeah.
Just like what happened to those indigenous populations is like really foundational to both nations, and both groups of nations. So it made those nations to the South like a different type of society. And then add on top of that sort of commitment to social democracy is a completely different ideology than is present in the United States.
Because the individual rights fetishism of the United States is predicated on the belief that the unleashing of individual ambition and letting people pursue their interests is what will create a virtuous society.
Mm-hmm.
And the way you do that is that you restrain the state as much as possible. Now, people like Simon Bolivar and other independence leaders, they liked the United States. They would have liked to have it. But they looked at Spanish America and they looked at 3 centuries of an empire that organized itself on difference and in which a small group of landed people owned all of the wealth and all of the land. And they realized that, that they understood that like they weren't going to create a virtuous society by unleashing individual ambition and restraining the state. They needed an activist state in order to equalize things and create citizens. And then eventually this transforms into what, social rights and social democracy. The Mexican Revolution in 1910, their constitution in 1917 was the world's first constitution that included social rights.
Wow.
Before Weimar, before India, before France, they guaranteed the right to education, the right to healthcare, the right to join a union, and they also had a clause in there of the right to the state to confiscate and redistribute property, which was a really big deal. But that was the world's first social democratic constitution.
And is that part of the root of the United States seeing these governments as illegitimate, as interfering with them, as sort of looking at Latin America as this unruly place that we have to manage? Essentially they're communists in the American imagination.
And it's also I think the way social rights become racialized and individual rights, right? Social rights become understood as black. And that's why Barack Obama, the most cautious Democrat you can imagine, who offered only the mildest policy reform. He might as well have been either from Zimbabwe or Finland, right? And as if he was putting forth a robust version of social rights, but of course he wasn't. But they treated him either as a European social democrat or some guy about to seize land and distribute it to his father.
But part of that belief is racialized, partially because he's a black man.
I think that's ultimately the hatred of him was rooted in this notion that even though he didn't put forward social rights, he believed in public policy, he believed kind of in reform, but and in Latin America, social rights are racialized because it was about trying to equalize a deeply racialized society and break up concentrated wealth and I think that's, to some degree, that's where the racialization. There's a funny story where Puerto Rico is obviously a colony of the United States and it has been since 1898, since the War of 1898, and in 1954 they decide that there's enough of a political consensus that they're going to draft a Commonwealth Constitution, like any state constitution. And it's mostly like the U.S. Constitution, except that there's a couple of clauses in it that guarantees education and healthcare. They send the Constitution to the U.S. Senate, and this is in 1954. The U.S. Senate freaked out. They thought this was Latin America's back door through Puerto Rico.
Right.
And they basically struck those 2 clauses and sent the Constitution back and said, "Here, you could approve this one."
Why did they have oversight over that?
It's Puerto Rico. It's a colony.
It's not a state, right? A state would be able to determine its own.
I guess, but Puerto Rico's an informal colony, because the Congress had jurisdiction over over Puerto Rico, and they had ultimately the last say over what constitution they would. But that gives you an example of how sharp the divide is, right, between a political culture that insists that democracy is defined by both political rights and social rights, and in fact, you need social rights if you want to make political rights real.
Yeah.
Because that was the other thing is the history of voting in Latin America, the movement for voting. A lot of reformers in the 19th century weren't that big on suffrage because they thought that suffrage would just give landowners more power. You know, that any given landowner would now be able to cast the 100 votes of their sharecroppers, right?
Right.
So they pushed for social rights in order to make political rights a reality. And so they understood that democracy entailed not just social rights and political rights, but that political rights depended on an expansion of social rights. In the United States, democracy is largely understood in individual as political rights, as individual rights, the right to vote, the right to assemble and whatnot. And, not to get too far afield, but there was an ideological project to try to align Latin America with the United States. Neoliberalism, the global, the Washington Consensus. After the Cold War, the United States, that neoliberalism wasn't just an economic program of austerity and balanced budgets and removing protection and open markets. It was also trying to get Latin America to accept a definition of democracy that was strictly individual rights, and that didn't work.
Yeah.
Most Latin Americans still think democracy entails some form of healthcare, and even conservatives. Well, not the new breed of
not Malay in them. But.
Not the MAGA conservatives, but yeah.
So how did these fundamental differences between the United States and Latin America, how those affect American foreign policy towards Latin America for, I know there's, tell me about the Monroe Doctrine and how that's changed over time. And all. I know that there's so much history to cover in like an hour podcast, but there's such a interesting fundamental difference in political philosophy that you've outlined. I'm just curious, how's this affect?
Well, it continues. That difference continues. So, Latin America, so the United States comes into being in 1776 on the east coast of a continent that its founders imagine as empty or empty enough. I mean, it's not empty, obviously. There's Spain, there'll eventually be Mexico, there's the Creeks, there's the Cherokees, there's Native Americans across the whole thing, but they don't imagine it as a continent in which there exists true European sovereignty or white man sovereignty anywhere, west of the Mississippi. And they imagine that it will eventually become part of the new nation, and it does. They're right. And in that process, the United States rehabilitates the doctrine of conquest, legitimates it. The Supreme Court says the doctrine of conquest is valid. When they invade Mexico, they invoke the doctrine of conquest. When they're fighting various indigenous groups, they're affirming the doctrine of conquest. The U.S. teaches the doctrine of conquest as a legitimate piece of international law well into the 1920s. In Latin America,
and that doctrine is just what? If you invade a place, you're allowed to.
Yeah, you're allowed to invade it, and you're allowed to keep what you got.
Okay, a pretty simple doctrine.
Yeah. It's an old Roman law doctrine. It was, the law of war. You for whatever reason you're waging war. If you take that land, it's yours. Latin America comes into being a generation later, mostly in the Wars of Independence started in 1810, but by the 1820s, Latin America is mostly independent except for Cuba and Puerto Rico. And they realize that they need a new international law in order to justify themselves, because each nation both legitimated and threatened the other. They legitimated the other in the sense that there were 7 republics at first, and any given republic, the fact that they broke from Spain and established their sovereignty and declared themselves a republic meant that another nation could do the same thing. So it's the legitimate. But under the old rules of law, what was going to stop Argentina doing what the United States doing and say, we want the Pacific too.
Right.
What's going to stop us? We'll just go take Chile, or Chile if want the Atlantic. So they came up with they renounced the doctrine of conquest. They said that it is no longer a legitimate doctrine in international law. It can't be. They insisted on the absolute sovereignty on individual nations and the legitimacy of borders that were inherited from the colonial state. And then they looked at the United States, and they looked at what the United States was doing and moving across the northern continent like a whirligig, taking land, waging war in Mexico. And all of that critique that had previously been applied to Spain, they now applied to the United States. They had, the independence leaders and the second generation that came after them had at their ready a whole moral and intellectual apparatus in which to understand what the United States is doing. Right. So this tension between the United States, which is insisting on the legitimacy of conquest, and Latin America, which is saying that we have to abolish conquest.
Yeah.
In other words, Latin America comes into being on a continent that's already filled up, that there's no more space left. They come into being already what is effectively a League of Nations or a United Nations. And all of the legal principles and philosophies that they developed to learn how to live with each other, a rejection of aggressive war, rejection of the doctrine of conquest, the recognition of national sovereignty, and more importantly, the presumption that international politics should be organized on the assumption of cooperation and shared interest rather than competition and dominance. All of those principles are what go into the United Nations. It's all at first the League of Nations, but then that's not very effective. But the United Nations, all of the principles that are present in the 1820s and 1830s and 1840s in Latin America and get worked out in Latin America, both among themselves and keeping an eye on the United States as the United States is taking Mexico and taking Spain and taking Florida and taking Cuba and taking Puerto Rico. All of those principles of what becomes the rules-based order or liberal internationalism or whatever you want to call it that gets put into place at the United Nations come from Latin America. Because Latin America comes into being already a League of Nations. Europe wasn't. Europe was a collection of monarchies and empires, and
it was warring and killing each other.
They were sending their gunboats to India, to Portugal. They were setting up the international slave system. The United States comes into being a set of bounded nations with no presumption of imperial ambitions. It is modernity. It's the modern nation system.
And I apologize for my ignorance. Have there been wars between Latin American countries?
Yes. This is the difference between the ideal and the real. But there were devastating wars between Chile and Bolivia, between Paraguay and Brazil in the 19th century. But all of those wars, their settlement was negotiated by affirming the principles of non-aggression and national sovereignty, right? Except for one devastating war early in the 20th century where Dutch royal shell backed Paraguay and Standard backed Bolivia because they thought there was oil in the Chaco, which is this hellish grassland, and there's no oil. There was no oil there.
Oh my God!
But they used all kind of remnants from World War I. All the munitions and planes that were used in World War I in Europe were sold to Paraguay and Bolivia, and they had this horrible war called the Chaco War. Except for that war, Latin America is the most peaceful continent in the world.
Wow.
All of the bloodletting was internal, directed at social movements, directed at the left, directed at guerrilla movements or union movements. And even today, Latin America has more environmental activists die in Latin or killed in Latin America than any other place in the world.
Wow.
But they don't stop. They keep organized. They stand unbowed. And this is what's remarkable about Latin America, right? Like they don't, and there's still no interstate war in Latin America. There's no nuclear arms race. Brazil's vice president famously said, Brazil has no enemies. Can you imagine that in the world that we live in today?
Yeah.
That the vice president of Brazil has no enemies.
J.D. Vance has a lot of enemies.
Yeah, but when you think about it, that's true. Brazil has no enemies.
Yeah.
Colombia has no enemies. Like none of these countries have enemies. They've learned how to create to the degree that, but it's not violent. The violent is internal, right? And the inability to create political stability and the violence directed at the left and social organizing.
How has the United States, viewed Latin America? I mean, I especially think about the piece that I know best is, the United States has meddled in, the governments and the democracies of these countries for years. Why has the United States taken that license? Right? Say, oh yeah, we can do whatever we want down there.
Yeah, between 1898 and 1992, the United States conducted 41 successful regime changes.
Wow. There's
there's
less than 41 countries. So it means every country more than once they have done a regime change.
There was the famous coup in Guatemala in 1954 that the CIA carried out, but then it did another one in 1963 when the left came back.
Wow.
It did, before the Cold War, it largely intervened because of economic interests, in collect debt or to open up a country for certain corporations. The United Fruit Company was heavy-handed in Central America and the Caribbean. It took Panama. Panama was a province of Colombia. The United States, separated it from Colombia and supported that country's freedom movement, and then dug a canal through it. And then during the Cold War, most of the interventions were done under the aegis of anti-communism, but also to just ensure stability for the most part, make sure no country broke away from the United States' sphere of influence.
It strikes me that when Trump says, "Oh, we're going to take back the Panama Canal," and the people of Panama say no fucking way. But when he said that, my first reaction was like, this is a very new, strange thing for an American president to say, to like, we're going to reclaim part of another country. But when you tell me that history, that the United States, basically is responsible for the foundation of the country in the first place, it's like Trump knows something about the United States' historic relationship to these countries that just, more recent presidents have either forgotten or not really exploited.
Yeah, it's almost like Trump is this kind of like creature assembled from different periods and histories of the past, and he somehow embodies it. Theodore Roosevelt was president when the United States seized or helped Panama achieve its independence from Colombia, and they built the canal. They started building the canal, and when Woodrow Wilson was president, and there's a lot in the book on Woodrow Wilson, because he was very instrumental. He understood that Pan-Americanism would be a model for his League of Nations, but he tried to establish better relations with Latin America. He apologized to Colombia, and he offered to pay them $25 million in compensation. Theodore Roosevelt went crazy. Theodore Roosevelt went on a tour of America, the United States, writing one op-ed after another, saying, if we have anything to apologize for, we should just give Panama back.
Wow.
And then, and he said, that we have nothing to apologize for. We have nothing to regret. And so Wilson was probably the first U.S. president to apologize for a U.S. action in Latin America. And then subsequently, Bill Clinton apologized for Guatemala in 1954. Colin Powell kind of apologized for Chile in 1973. So,
I mean, I'm curious about what would bring Bill Clinton to apologize for something that happened in the 50s. Like, Why bother at all?
Because the civil war that broke out after the CIA's overthrow in 1954 finally ended in 1996.
Jesus Christ.
And, I'm not somebody who carries a lot of water for the Clinton administration, but they were very good at declassifying a lot of documents to help the Truth Commission in Guatemala. And so I think as part of that process, Clinton apologized.
Declassified a bunch of documents, then read them, and like, oh shit, this was really bad.
Yeah.
Okay, I do.
Well, that's the thing about Latin America is even the most ardent, unapologetic defender of the projection of U.S. power in the world acknowledges that the United States maybe acted unhelpfully in Latin America. It's almost like the United States is geopolitical confessional. It's like forgive me, Father, for I have overthrown.
It's the one spot where we can take a little responsibility.
We take responsibility, and yes, of course, but of course, it's always turned around in some weird way. So Wilson educates himself on the United States' policy in Latin America, and this is in 1912. This is before a lot of the worst stuff happened, but Texas and Cuba and Puerto Rico and Colombia and Panama. And he comes and he uses that. He says, Latin America has taught us contrition. Latin America, in their criticisms of us, have humbled us. And that humility now makes us capable and to assume the role of world leader, because we will now act not in our interests, but our ideals, because we've been humbled by Latin America. We've been chastised. We've been taught. And so it's an interesting little kind of ideological jujitsu that he does there. And I think he believed it. He's like, Latin America has every right to criticize us. We've been arrogant. We've been aggressive. We've been interventionist, but their criticisms have chastened us, and we are now a humble nation, and we are now ready to assume our role as world leader.
I'm familiar with that mode when you fucked up and you get called out, and then you're like, I have learned my lesson. Yes, and I am better for it, and thank you so much. But how long did that last? How long did that pose last for the United States?
It didn't last. Wilson. He basically caved around the League of Nations. His first vision of the League of Nations was actually quite progressive. Yeah. And it was a vision of decolonization and national sovereignty, but there was no way that Great Britain and France or nationalists in the United States were, insisted that Wilson affirm the Monroe Doctrine within the League of Nations in its most interventionist form. And so Wilson kind of caved. And so what emerged from the League of Nations, the shape of the League of Nations, the final shape of it was one that affirmed European hegemony and domination.
And so the Monroe Doctrine is the idea that the United States is just able to do whatever the fuck it wants in Latin America, right? But
it's more complicated. It's kind of like the same thing. So the Monroe Doctrine, James Monroe, it has to issue a doctrine because Latin America is getting its independence. It's clear that they're going to win. It's clear that Spain is going to lose. So James Monroe issues it's not a doctrine. He has 5 paragraphs in a long State of the Union address. Yeah. That's not even contiguous paragraphs. And one of them, Spanish Americans like. One of the paragraphs says the United States is not going to allow, there is no part of the Americas that is eligible for reconquest. So Spanish Americans see this as analogous to their rejection of the doctrine of conquest.
Yeah,
they like that.
He's saying Europeans stay the hell out.
Hands off. They see it as an affirmation of their rejection of the doctrine of conquest, an anti-colonial principle. They like that. There's a couple of paragraphs down where the United States says we're going to see any interference in any part of the New World as affecting us, and we will have the right to intervene. Now, that part of the Monroe Doctrine stays quiet for a while, but the United States doesn't have a lot of power. It's not until the 1840s and 1850s that it gets revived. And Monroe Doctrine becomes a kind of universal warrant for the United States to act at will wherever it sees and it becomes much more of a doctrine of mandatory power or informal empire. And of course that's when it becomes criticized by Latin America. That's when it becomes, and then, then different presidents add corollaries. Theodore Roosevelt added a famous corollary that the United States is the policeman of the Western Hemisphere. Mm-hmm. So that's when the Monroe Doctrine becomes what we think of it as now.
And
as it is now.
It's just a fascinating idea that there's something called the Monroe Doctrine that future presidents might say, yes, we must uphold the Monroe Doctrine, when this is just an idea that James Monroe said once. It's not a treaty. It's not a amendment to the Constitution. It's not a law. It's just an idea of it's akin to manifest destiny. It's just, hey, here's what we think. And then everyone else just has to agree or disagree with this because it's something a president said once and some other presidents agree to. It's sort of a bizarre way to make policy.
Well, other countries have laws, or I don't know, and we have doctrines. And it wasn't even called a doctrine at first. It wasn't even called a doctrine until the British started meddling in Central America in the 1850s. And the Europeans kind of made fun of the pretentiousness of it when it did become a doctrine. But Wilson go back to Wilson, when he was trying to push forward a more progressive vision of the League of Nations, he tried to revive that element of the Monroe Doctrine that was anti-colonial. And it provoked a backlash in the United States among nationalists. We want the Monroe Doctrine pure as it was. There is a kind of fetish of the Monroe Doctrine akin to the fetish of the Constitution, that there's an original intent. And that original intent, it grants the United States mandatory powers within the Americas.
The original intent of James Monroe.
The original intent of James Monroe. Now, during the League of Nations, Japan was happy. Japan said, put the Monroe Doctrine in there because we want our own Monroe Doctrine for Asia. And then, Hitler's theorist Carl Schmitt said, all Germany is doing in Middle Europe is exercising its own version of the Monroe Doctrine. Great Britain said what it did in Africa was basically a version of the Monroe Doctrine. So for other European empires, it became a kind of symbol of informal empire, mandatory power.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem like there's many high-minded ideals here. It's just, hey, we are powerful and we have the ability to protect our interests by meddling in other countries' affairs, and so we shall. What is even the doctrine other than we do what the fuck we want? I don't get it.
Except for that one little bit where that could be read as anti-colonial.
Right.
Wilson has this great line. If he comes back from Paris and he's trying to sell the League of Nations, and he says, I must admit, every time I read the Monroe Doctrine, I have trouble understanding what it means. I have trouble pinning down what it actually is. And the thing when nobody within that State of the Union address, Madison, aside from those 5 paragraphs that people kind of bunch together and say is the Monroe Doctrine, the whole State of the Union address is just this ode to expansion and conquest and westward expansion.
Yeah. So
if you situate the Monroe Doctrine in relationship to that, it's part of that large argument that the United States' sovereignty is based on a revival of the doctrine of conquest, whereas Latin America's sovereignty was based on a rejection of the doctrine of conquest.
And so how do the Latin American nations, view the United States historical? Because, on the one hand, okay, maybe they're protecting us from colonialism. On the other hand, it's this massive, powerful country that's constantly, getting involved in ways it maybe shouldn't. And that is seemingly a different sort of nation. It's a white nation founded on individual liberty rather than what you described.
Well, in the 19th century, there was William Walker, Tennessee mercenary, seizes Nicaragua, declares himself president, and reestablishes slavery after Nicaragua had abolished slavery 20 years earlier, and he reestablishes slavery. That's the beginning of Latin America. That's the beginning of Latin American nationalism, nationalists distinguishing themselves as Latin versus Saxon America. Uh-huh. Latin America is spiritual, it's diaphanous, it's humanist. Saxon America is conquering, it's utilitarian, it's materialist. And so this tension between that there are two Americas emerge in the 1850s, and it goes on, and it's deeply rooted. I mean, Los Tigres del Norte, a norteño band that's popular among undocumented migrants in northern Mexico, they have a great song called, and it was released on September 11, 2001, coincidentally enough. Somos más Americanos. We are more American. So there's a contest over the very idea of America.
Yes.
That said, Roosevelt, FDR, in 1933, in the midst of the Depression, in the midst of this retraction of U.S. power, capitulates to the United States and renounces the doctrine of conquest, renounces the right of intervention, and agrees to recognize the absolute sovereignty of all nations, no matter what their size, in the internal and external and domestic and foreign affairs. This creates enormous goodwill. This goes back to your question about how do they see us. And it's enormously consequential, right? From 1933 up until the Cold War, there is a convergence. There is a kind of continental New Deal, right? The left wing of FDR's brain trust see Latin America as a place to expand and create a kind of new way of thinking about foreign policy. We all know the good neighbor policy as a phrase that FDR adopts to talk about Latin America and talk about this new dispensation of treating Latin America with respect. But the good neighbor leagues were also his get out the vote mechanism for his 1936 election, in which he was threatened. I mean, the right was on the rise. The United States was close to, the hard men and the businesses and the paramilitary security forces and the Liberty Leagues. So Roosevelt set up the Good Neighbor Leagues as an alternative to the white supremacy of the Liberty Leagues, the Saxon supremacy. And the Good Neighbor Leagues became the venue in which Roosevelt was able to express this new kind of ethos. Domestically, it meant an acceptance of pluralism, your Americanism and mine, Roosevelt said. But locally, it was the Good Neighbor Leagues who organized blacks in Chicago and the South, ethnics in the cities, Native Americans on reservation in the Southwest, Chicanos, and it signaled a new kind of cultural pluralism. An alternative to the Saxon supremacy that the Liberty Leagues were pushing. And Roosevelt loved the phrase good neighbor so much he wanted to patent it. So you had the good neighbor policy, but you also had the good neighbor leagues, and it comes together in this kind of continental New Deal. Roosevelt wins that 1936 election with 27 million votes, more votes than any human being ever won. And he won on basically a social democratic or social liberal policy.
Yeah.
And the first thing that he does when he wins that landslide, I mean, an unbelievable mandate, the very first thing he does, he goes to Buenos Aires.
Wow.
And he starts to build a continental alliance that begins to prepare for World War II. And it's that period from 1933 when the United States does reject the doctrine of conquest and gives up the right to intervention up until about 1948, the beginning of the Cold War. There's this enormous goodwill in which Latin America lines up behind Latin, and the left and Washington tilts towards the left in Latin America. It allows Cardenas in Mexico to expropriate Standard Oil fields, and it doesn't punish them. It allows, and it basically it basically, what they're worried about, what the geostrategists in Washington are worried about is that Latin America had the potential to become a hemispheric Spanish Civil War. Because Latin America more or less had all the sociological variables as Spain did. Conservative Catholicism, it had a patrician culture, and they were afraid that Franco, and they were rightly so, would win the war and ally with Hitler and Italy. They were afraid if that happened on a Latin American scale, that they would lose the Western Hemisphere, that the United States would be isolated, that they would be and so the New Deal tilted to the left in Latin America and supported the left against the right, and it was that period that the United States and Latin America had the closest convergence. Everybody, Vargas in Brazil and Cardenas and other, and they understood themselves as doing the analog of the New Deal. They were expanding labor rights and expanding
the combination of FDR's social democratic policies and then the global war on fascism basically caused them to become aligned. And you said that Latin America was really important in the defeat of fascism in that period.
Yeah, I mean, well, logistically, the United States didn't have to fight one battle for resources. Latin America provided the oil, provided the minerals, the copper, the iron, I mean, everything, and obscure minerals that even went into the Manhattan Project. Brazil, that bit that butts out into Atlantic, became the trampoline, what FDR called the trampoline of the Atlantic, in which nonstop cargo flights flew into Northern Africa to get material into Europe and men into Europe. And then just ideologically, Roosevelt held up Latin America as what the world should look like when the war was over.
Yeah,
a region moving towards social democracy. Because Latin Americans, as I said, they didn't think that they were fighting just against fascism. They thought they were fighting for social democracy. And I think a lot of people in the world at that time thought that was the case.
And a lot of them were wrong about what was being fought, at least with the United States leading the way. I think a lot of Americans thought that too, but it was not where we ended up.
No.
Let's come back to the present day. We're also seeing this strange alignment again between the populist right movement in the United States and throughout South America. So that's sort of where we began. Let's end there as well. How do you see that in the context of the history of Latin America and the United States?
Well, I think Latin America is on the knife edge in some ways. I mean, it could go either way. As I mentioned, the majority of countries are ruled by center-left governments, but every election is fought. Is fought. Down to the wire. It's the early 2000s was a time in which the left had much more rhetorical and electoral hegemony. They were winning election after election across the continent. Now each election is close. It's close. It's tight because because for a lot of different reasons, the left has lost a lot of that rhetorical hegemony, while the right has kind of. It's good at this kind of. It's not so much that it establishes hegemony. It establishes kind of a conspiratorial world making. It almost establishes. It substitutes conspiracism for hegemony, right?
No, it's an alternate universe.
Yes, an alternate universe, and and they're good at that at spreading that darkness, right? That the groomers and the anchor babies and this, and so some countries are solid. I mean, look at Mexico. Claudia Sheinbaum, the Jewish granddaughter of communist refugees from Eastern Europe, is now sitting in what was the Catholic Viceroy's chair. The Catholic Viceroy was the most important Spanish official in the Americas, and she has 85% approval rating.
Yeah,
and she's like taking the politics of the country away from the technocrats, away from the neoliberal technocrats.
Yeah,
and she's limited. She's constrained by there's still violence, the cartels. She can only do so much, but she has She has enormous legitimacy. But then, Lula is, even though in the past he strode the world stage, enormously popular, he's like, he's running neck and neck. And if he runs in 2026 against Bolsonaro or against somebody's, so it could go either way. I mean, it could go either way. But the thing is, Latin Americans never give up. So when Bolsonaro was president during those 4 years, and he turned Brazil into the sideshow, the way that Trump is turns the United States into this carnival, the world's largest social movement, the landless movement of Brazil, grew in size and strength under Bolsonaro. They now administer land the size of Switzerland and Bolivia in Brazil. Enormous social movement. And like I said, in Latin America has more environmentalist activists killed than anywhere else in the world, and yet environmental activists continue to fight. Feminists and trans rights activists, you would think that after all of the violence, that after all of the terror, from the horrors of the conquest and the tortures of the Inquisition to the disappearances of the Cold War, that Latin Americans would have given up on the idea of democracy, much less social democracy. But they keep fighting for it. And that's the thing about Latin America. Latin America's nationalism, it's not a toxic nationalism. The predations of neoliberalism turned the Philippines and Hungary and all of these countries and Turkey into really nasty places, angry, bitter, against the global. There's none of that. The left doesn't participate in that kind of anti-global, that kind of conspiratorial globalist stuff, right? It's the Jews, right? They understand capitalism, they understand how it works, they understand imperialism, they understand how it works, and Latin American activists are still the best bearers of, they take the Enlightenment at its word. It's like Latin America is like the last region that takes the Enlightenment at its word.
Wow, that's an incredibly positive and optimistic view. Do you have
except
yeah, well, give me the except.
Well, Bukele in El Salvador and Javier Milei in Argentina, people are tired of crime, they're tired of violence. They're confused by the disinformation. There's a lot of, the right has accept that, the right has made a comeback. But even if they do come back, even in a country like El Salvador, where abortion, which has the most horrible abortion laws in the world, women with miscarriages go to jail for 30 years.
Wow.
If they can't prove it was a real miscarriage. And there are women fighting to roll back those laws and they're incredibly vulnerable, and they're targeted for murder and violence, and yet these social movements don't give up.
I often make the mistake of asking historians at the end of an interview what you think is going to happen in the future, and so I won't make the mistake here. But I do feel like there's optimism from you about the region, despite these slides backwards or slides towards the right.
Long-term optimism, short-term pessimism. Maybe, or maybe.
That's a pretty good philosophy for humanity overall. I think
it's too early to tell. What isn't that when they ask Chow and Lai what he thought about the French Revolution? He said it's too early to tell.
Too early to tell. And I think that's apocryphal. I actually read the whole history of that quote recently because he was talking about something that happened more recently in France, and it's like misremembered as being that he was talking about the French Revolution, but it's too good of a line.
It's too good of a line.
Yeah.
It's too early.
And maybe that's true of all of the Americas, right? Well, I can't thank you enough for being here. I could talk to you for hours, but I think we have to let you get back to your work. The name of the book is America. You pronounced it beautifully. Say it again.
America.
Yeah.
Yes, it's like the Gulf of America.
Yes. Oh my God, we didn't even fucking get into that. The Gulf of America. Give me a take really quickly on the naming of the Gulf of Mexico.
It's just Trump. It's just the culture wars. Like Trump constantly opening new fronts in the culture war. Who thought the Gulf of America was going to be the next front in the culture war? But he comes up with this idea of the Gulf of Mexico was going to be the. It was called the Gulf of Mexico since the 1500s. And so So he's brilliant at opening up these new fronts in the culture war. So now it's a contestation over what is America. I mean, we can go into this in depth, right? Whether the United States people who live in the United States who call themselves American, and and other people who call them, the rest of Latin America calls themselves American.
Yes.
So, who is an American?
I, in fact, got in, a little bit of trouble, not trouble, but we had I had a video come out years ago about, Christopher Columbus and all that, and just like a very basic debunking of the myths that we grew up with in America or in the United States. And I had many, many people from Latin America saying, no, we call this America. Yeah. We call all of it America. And so the way
Somos más americanos. We are more American.
Yes.
Que los hijos de los anglo-saxones. Than the sons of the Anglo-Saxons. We are more American.
What a beautiful line. What a beautiful assertion. And that's a pop music hit.
Yeah, Tigre, it was enormously popular.
Yes.
Tigres del Norte, the Tigers of the North. They're a super group.
In LA, I hear about them all the time.
Yeah. And that song was released on September 11th, 2001. Talk about weird historical
amazing.
Convergences. Yeah.
God, I mean, it's such a fascinating history that we think of, at least white Americans think about far too little, is this relationship and the deep history connecting it. I can't thank you enough for coming on the show
to
talk to us about it. People can of course pick up a copy of the book at our special bookshop, factuallypod.com/books. Where else can folks find it? Where can they find your work online?
Well, I gotta say I have a webpage, not a very active webpage, but greggrandin.com. And I guess you just Google Greg Grandin and you'll find a lot of stuff. But yeah, the webpage, greggrandin.com, will have other books that I've done.
Thank you so much for coming on, Greg. It's been wonderful.
Much, thank you.
Well, thank you once again to Greg for coming on the show. If you want to pick up a copy of his book, you can do so at factuallypod.com/books. Just a reminder, any book you buy through that link will support not just this show, but your local bookstore as well. Please check it out, factuallypod.com/books if you like to read, and I know you do. Also, if you want to support the show directly, you can do so on Patreon. Patreon.com/Adam Conover. $5 a month gets you every episode of the show ad-free. For $15 a month, I will read your name in the credits of the show. This week, I want to thank Avaro Eggberger, Tracy, Nicholas Jose Saura, Aaron Harmony, Joseph Mode, Rodney Pattenham, Greg 0692, Marcella Johnson, and Matthew Bertelson, aka The Bunkmeister. If you want me to read your name or your silly username on the show, once again, patreon.com/Adam Conover. We would love to have you. Of course, if you want to come see me on the road, I'm announcing a brand new bunch of tour dates. Head to adamconover.net to check them out. I'm headed all across the country. Would love to see you out there. I want to thank my producers, Sam Rodman and Tony Wilson, everybody here at HeadGum for making the show possible. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time on Factually.
That was a HeadGum podcast.